Marcus had always been fascinated by military technology, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would experience at the International Defense Exhibition in Abu Dhabi. As a freelance military journalist, he had covered conflicts in 3 different countries, but this assignment felt different. The sprawling exhibition hall stretched endlessly before him, filled with the latest innovations in defense technology from around the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished concrete floors as Marcus adjusted his press badge and checked his camera equipment. His editor had given him a simple brief: document the most impressive weapon systems on display and write a comprehensive piece about the future of military hardware. What seemed like a straightforward assignment would soon become the most unsettling experience of his career. Moving through the crowded aisles, Marcus observed dozens of military contractors showcasing their latest creations. Representatives in sharp suits demonstrated everything from tactical drones to armored vehicles, each trying to outdo the competition with increasingly sophisticated technology. The atmosphere buzzed with the energy of international arms dealers, military officials, and journalists like himself, all circulating through the maze of exhibits. Marcus stopped at several displays, taking notes on advanced communication systems and next-generation body armor. The German booth featured a revolutionary night vision system that could detect heat signatures from unprecedented distances. At the Israeli pavilion, engineers demonstrated an autonomous drone capable of identifying and engaging targets without human intervention. Each innovation represented years of research and development, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in modern warfare. As he moved deeper into the exhibition, Marcus noticed the displays becoming more specialized and expensive. The casual atmosphere of the entrance gave way to something more serious and professional. Security guards positioned themselves more frequently, and access to certain areas required additional clearance. The weapons on display grew larger and more intimidating, representing the kind of firepower that could change the outcome of entire battles. Near the center of the hall, Marcus encountered the first truly impressive piece of equipment, a massive artillery system capable of launching guided projectiles over 30 kilometers with pinpoint accuracy. The Italian manufacturers had surrounded it with detailed technical specifications and impressive video demonstrations. Marcus spent 20 minutes documenting the system, interviewing the lead engineer about its capabilities and potential applications. The journalist's confidence grew as he navigated between exhibits, engaging with manufacturers and gathering material for his article. His experience covering military conflicts had given him the knowledge to ask intelligent questions and understand the technical explanations. The representatives respected his background and provided detailed information about their products, often sharing insights that wouldn't be available to casual observers. However, as Marcus approached the more exclusive section of the exhibition, he began to notice subtle changes in the environment. The lighting became more focused, the crowds thinned out, and the security presence intensified. Signs indicated that certain areas required special authorization, and guards checked credentials more thoroughly. The weapons displayed in this section represented a different category entirely, systems designed for the most serious military operations. Marcus presented his press credentials to the guard at the restricted area's entrance. After a brief radio consultation, the guard waved him through, explaining that journalists were welcome but must stay within designated areas. The atmosphere inside felt different immediately. The casual chatter and sales presentations gave way to quiet, serious conversations between military officials and defense contractors. The first display that caught Marcus's attention was a collection of precision rifles arranged in a glass case. Unlike the standard military weapons he had seen in combat zones, these represented the pinnacle of sniper technology. Each rifle bore the distinctive markings of different manufacturers, with technical specifications that highlighted their incredible accuracy and range capabilities. As Marcus examined the rifles, he felt confident in his ability to understand and document their significance. His military reporting had exposed him to various weapon systems, and he could appreciate the engineering excellence represented in the display. The CheyTac M200 sat prominently among the collection, its distinctive design immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with long-range precision shooting. Marcus photographed the rifle collection from multiple angles, making notes about the technical specifications provided on small plaques beside each weapon. The CheyTac M200's details impressed him. Effective range exceeding 2 kilometers, specialized ammunition designed for maximum accuracy, and a modular design that allowed for field customization. He had encountered similar weapons during his IDO coverage of special operations, though never with such detailed technical information. Moving past the rifle display with practiced ease, Marcus felt satisfied with the material he had gathered so far. His article was taking shape in his mind, and he anticipated covering several more significant weapon systems before the day ended. The exhibition had proven more accessible than expected, and his press credentials had opened doors to areas that might otherwise be restricted. The transition from the rifle display to the next section happened so gradually that Marcus almost missed it. The lighting shifted from the bright exhibition standards to something more subdued, creating an atmosphere that felt distinctly different from the rest of the hall. Fewer people moved through this area, and those who did spoke in hushed tones, conducting their business with obvious discretion. Marcus noticed that the displays in this section lacked the flashy presentations and promotional materials that characterized the rest of the exhibition. Instead, single items sat behind reinforced glass or within secure enclosures, accompanied by minimal signage. The focus had shifted from marketing spectacle to serious demonstration of capability, suggesting that the audience here consisted of decision-makers rather than casual observers. As he moved forward, Marcus observed several items that seemed oddly out of place in a weapons exhibition. A small electronic device sat in one case with no explanation beyond a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to him. Another display featured what appeared to be an ordinary briefcase, though the level of security surrounding it suggested otherwise. The atmosphere grew increasingly mysterious with each step. The journalist's attention was drawn to a conversation between two men in expensive suits, speaking in what sounded like Russian. They gestured toward a display that Marcus couldn't see, clearly from his position, their body language suggesting they were discussing something of significant importance. When they noticed his approach, their conversation stopped abruptly, and they moved away with obvious deliberation. Marcus continued forward, his curiosity growing with each unusual display. His experience as a military journalist had taught him to recognize when something was more significant than it appeared, and everything in this section triggered those instincts. The careful placement of items, the enhanced security measures, and the behavior of other visitors all suggested that he had wandered into an area dealing with more sensitive materials. Ahead of him, Marcus spotted what initially appeared to be another weapons display, but as he approached, he realized it was something entirely different. A circular emblem, roughly the size of a dinner plate, sat mounted on a simple black stand behind a sheet of bulletproof glass. The emblem itself appeared to be made of some dark metal, possibly titanium or specialized steel, with intricate engravings that created complex geometric patterns. The most striking feature of the emblem was the number prominently displayed in its center, 2950. The digits were rendered in a precise military-style font that suggested official designation rather than decorative choice. Around the central number, smaller symbols and markings created concentric circles of information that Marcus couldn't immediately interpret. The overall design conveyed authority and purpose, though its specific meaning remained unclear. Unlike every other display in the exhibition, this emblem had no accompanying signage, no technical specifications, and no manufacturer identification. A small placard bore only a reference number and the notation, "Classification, Restricted Access." The absence of explanation made the display more intriguing rather than less, creating an air of mystery that seemed intentional. Marcus approached the display with growing fascination. His journalistic instincts told him that items displayed, without explanation, often held the greatest significance, particularly in environments where everything else was carefully documented and promoted. The emblem's placement in this restricted section, combined with its unique presentation, suggested importance that went beyond its simple appearance. As he studied the emblem more closely, Marcus began to notice details that weren't immediately obvious. The metal surface bore microscopic markings that appeared to be text in multiple languages, though the characters were too small to read without magnification. The geometric patterns around the central number seemed to follow mathematical principles, creating designs that suggested precision engineering rather than artistic decoration. The number 2950 began to take on greater significance as Marcus considered its possible meanings. In his experience covering military operations, specific numbers often represented distances, coordinates, or operational designations. The precision of the display and the security surrounding it suggested that this particular number held special meaning within military or intelligence circles. Marcus attempted to photograph the emblem, but discovered that his camera's flash reflected off the protective glass, obscuring the details he wanted to capture. As he adjusted his position and camera settings, he became aware that a security guard had positioned himself nearby, watching his activities with obvious attention. The guard made no move to interfere, but his presence added to the tension surrounding the mysterious display. The journalist found himself spending far more time examining the emblem than he had planned. Something about its simplicity combined with its obvious importance created a compelling puzzle that demanded solution. His military reporting experience had exposed him to classified materials before, but never something presented so mysteriously within a public exhibition setting. Marcus studied the emblem. He began to feel an unexpected sense of unease. The combination of the restricted location, the mysterious presentation, and the obvious security attention created an atmosphere that felt increasingly oppressive. What had started as journalistic curiosity was evolving into something that felt more personal and immediate, though he couldn't identify exactly what was causing his growing discomfort. The moment of recognition hit Marcus like a physical blow, stopping him mid-step as the significance of the number 2950 suddenly crystallized in his mind. His breath caught in his throat as memories from 3 years earlier came flooding back, with devastating clarity. The number wasn't just a random designation or measurement, it was a distance marker that connected to the most traumatic assignment of his journalism career. Marcus's hands began to shake as he recalled that terrible day in the mountains of Afghanistan, where he had been embedded with a special operations unit tasked with eliminating a high-value target. The mission had been planned with military precision, involving weeks of surveillance and intelligence gathering. As the designated journalist documenting the operation, Marcus had been positioned at an observation post exactly 2,950 meters from the target location. The memory came back in fragments, each piece adding to his growing distress. He remembered the crisp mountain air, the way the morning light had illuminated the valley below, and the confident chatter of the soldiers as they prepared for what should have been a routine elimination mission. The target was supposed to be a terrorist commander responsible for multiple attacks against coalition forces, and intelligence indicated he would be alone in a remote compound. Marcus recalled checking his equipment that morning, ensuring his cameras were ready to document what military officials had assured him would be a textbook precision strike. The soldiers had been professional and confident, their equipment state-of-the-art, their planning meticulous. Everything about the operation had suggested it would proceed exactly as briefed, with minimal risk and maximum effectiveness. The sniper taking the shot had been using a CheyTac M200, the same rifle Marcus had casually photographed just minutes earlier in the exhibition. The weapon had been positioned on a specialized mount, its scope calibrated for the exact distance to the target. Military calculations had confirmed the range at precisely 2,950 meters, a challenging but achievable shot for a weapon and marksman of that caliber. As Marcus stood frozen before the emblem, the details of what happened next played out in his memory with horrible clarity. The shot had been taken at the designated time, and through his telephoto lens, Marcus had watched the impact in the distant compound. Initially, everything appeared to have gone according to plan, with the target eliminated and the mission seemingly completed successfully. However, within minutes of the shot, intelligence reports began coming through the radio that painted a completely different picture. The compound hadn't contained the intended target at all. Instead, the victim had been a local school teacher who had been using the building as temporary shelter while traveling between villages. The intelligence that formed the basis for the entire operation had been fundamentally flawed. The realization that they had killed an innocent civilian had devastated everyone involved in the operation. Marcus remembered the stunned silence that fell over the observation post as the truth became clear, followed by increasingly frantic radio communications as military commanders tried to understand how such a catastrophic error had occurred. The professional confidence of the morning had evaporated, replaced by horror and disbelief. The aftermath had been even worse than the initial mistake. Investigation revealed that the intelligence had been deliberately falsified by a source who had personal grievances against the school teacher. The entire operation had been manipulated from the beginning, turning a precision military strike into an assassination based on personal revenge. Everyone involved, from the commanders to the sniper to Marcus himself, had been unwitting participants in murder. Marcus had struggled with overwhelming guilt in the months following the incident. Although he had been present only as a journalist and had no role in the decision-making process, he felt complicit in the tragedy. His photographs and reporting had documented the operation, creating a permanent record of an innocent person's death. The images haunted his sleep and made continuing his career as a military journalist increasingly difficult. The military investigation that followed had been thorough but ultimately futile. The source who provided the false intelligence had disappeared, likely killed by the same people who had manipulated him into providing the information. The official report had classified the incident as an intelligence failure, but that designation provided no comfort to those who had lived through the reality of the situation. Standing before the Emblem with its prominent 250-meter designation, Marcus felt the full weight of that traumatic experience crashing down on him again. The distance marker that had once represented professional precision now symbolized the most devastating mistake of his career. His casual confidence in navigating military exhibitions evaporated as the psychological impact of the memory overwhelmed his composure. The security guard who had been watching Marcus noticed his sudden change in behavior and took a step closer, clearly concerned about the journalist's obvious distress. Other visitors in the restricted area began to take notice as Marcus stood frozen before the display, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking. What had started as a routine documentation assignment had become a deeply personal confrontation with a trauma he thought he had processed and moved beyond. Marcus tried to force himself to move away from the display, but his legs felt weak and unsteady. The combination of the unexpected trigger and the flood of traumatic memories had created a psychological crisis that he was unprepared to handle in such a public setting. Marcus felt his chest tightening as panic began to take hold, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid despite his attempts to maintain control. The sterile exhibition hall seemed to close in around him as his body's stress response activated with full force. Sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his vision started to blur at the edges as the physiological symptoms of a panic attack intensified. The security guard approached with obvious concern, speaking in accented English as he asked if Marcus needed assistance. But the journalist could barely process the words through the roaring in his ears and the overwhelming flood of traumatic memories that continued to assault his consciousness. Every detail of that horrible day in Afghanistan played out with cinematic clarity, as if his mind was forcing him to relive every moment of the tragedy. Marcus tried to step back from the display, but his legs buckled slightly, forcing him to grab onto a nearby barrier for support. The simple act of movement seemed to require enormous effort as his body continued to react to the psychological trauma. Other visitors in the restricted area had begun to notice the commotion, some stopping their conversations to stare at the obviously distressed journalist. The images from his camera that day flashed through Marcus's mind in rapid succession. The confident preparations of the soldiers, the pristine mountain landscape, the moment of the shot, and then the devastating realization that followed. He could hear the radio chatter again, the confusion and growing horror as the truth became apparent. The professional excitement of documenting a military operation had transformed into the worst kind of nightmare. A second security guard arrived and began speaking into his radio, likely calling for medical assistance or supervisory support. Marcus wanted to explain that he was fine, that he just needed a moment to collect himself, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt constricted, and every attempt to speak resulted in nothing more than shallow gasps for air. The weight of survivor's guilt, which Marcus thought he had processed through months of counseling, came crashing back with renewed intensity. He remembered the sleepless nights following the incident, the way he had questioned every decision that led him to be present for such a tragedy. The rational understanding that he bore no responsibility for the intelligence failure had never fully erased the emotional conviction that he could have somehow prevented the innocent man's death. Marcus's vision began to tunnel as the panic attack reached its peak intensity. The faces of concerned security guards and curious onlookers became distant and unclear, while the Emblem's 2,950-meter marking remained sharp and accusatory in his peripheral vision. The number had transformed from a simple designation into a symbol of personal failure and complicity in tragedy. The journalist found himself reliving not just the moment of the shot, but the entire aftermath that had nearly destroyed his career and his mental health. He remembered the formal investigation, the careful language used in official reports, and the way everyone involved had struggled to process what had happened. The sniper had requested immediate transfer to a different unit, unable to continue his specialized role after the incident. Marcus recalled the funeral he had attended weeks later, after tracking down the victim's family through local contacts. The schoolteacher had been survived by a wife and 3 young children who had no understanding of why their father had been killed. Standing at the gravesite, Marcus had struggled with the knowledge that his presence and documentation had been part of the system that led to this innocent man's death. The panic attack intensified as Marcus remembered the questions that had haunted him for months afterward. What if he had asked more probing questions about the intelligence? What if he had noticed something during the surveillance that might have revealed the error? What if he had simply chosen to cover a different story that week? The rational mind understood that such questions were pointless, but trauma doesn't respond to rational analysis. One of the security guards was now speaking directly into Marcus's ear, trying to get his attention and assess his condition. The guard's training had apparently included dealing with medical emergencies, and he was following standard protocols for someone experiencing a panic attack. Marcus could sense the professionalism and concern, but it felt distant and muted compared to the intensity of his psychological distress. The exhibition hall around Marcus began to feel surreal and disconnected from reality. The casual atmosphere of defense contractors selling their products seemed obscene, when contrasted with his memories of how those same products had been used to destroy an innocent life. The CheyTac M200 he had photographed earlier was no longer just a sophisticated piece of engineering. It had become a symbol of precision turned to tragic error. Marcus tried to focus on his breathing, using techniques he had learned in therapy sessions, but the panic had taken on a life of its own. His body continued to flood with stress hormones, creating physical symptoms that reinforced his psychological distress. The simple act of standing upright required conscious effort, and he felt increasingly disconnected from his surroundings. The security guards had created a small perimeter around Marcus, giving him space while ensuring he didn't collapse or injure himself. Their professional handling of the situation was impressive, but Marcus felt embarrassed by the public nature of his breakdown. As a journalist, he was accustomed to observing and documenting rather than becoming the center of attention, and the role reversal added to his psychological distress. As the immediate intensity of the panic attack began to subside, Marcus became aware of a voice speaking quietly but urgently nearby. Through his gradually clearing vision, he saw an older man in an expensive suit talking seriously with the head of security. The man's bearing and the deference shown by the guard suggested he held significant authority within the exhibition organization. The distinguished gentleman approached Marcus with obvious concern, introducing himself as Colonel Morrison, retired from military intelligence and now serving as a senior advisor to the exhibition organizers. His manner was professional but compassionate, suggesting experience dealing with individuals experiencing trauma-related episodes. Morrison asked the security guards to provide some privacy while he spoke with Marcus directly. "I recognize the symptoms," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with combat trauma extensively. "You've seen something here that connects to a difficult memory, I've watched dozens of veterans and military personnel experience similar reactions when confronted with unexpected triggers in environments like this. Marcus found himself able to speak for the first time since the panic attack began, though his voice was shaky and uncertain. He briefly explained his background as a military journalist and mentioned the incident in Afghanistan, though he couldn't bring himself to provide specific details. Morrison listened without interruption, his expression showing understanding rather than curiosity or judgment. The colonel revealed that the emblem display had been specifically designed to honor fallen personnel from various classified operations, though the specific details couldn't be shared publicly. The 2,950-meter designation wasn't random. It represented the distance of a particular operation that had gone tragically wrong due to intelligence failures. Marcus's reaction had immediately identified him as someone connected to that specific incident. Morrison explained that several participants from the Afghanistan operation had experienced similar reactions when encountering the memorial display. The emblem served as both a recognition of service and a reminder of the costs associated with intelligence failures in military operations. It was placed in the restricted area specifically because of its potential to trigger traumatic responses in those who had been involved. The revelation that the display was actually a memorial, rather than a celebration or technical specification, changed Marcus's understanding of what he was experiencing. The emblem wasn't glorifying the precision of long-range shooting. It was acknowledging the tragic consequences of that particular shot. The lack of explanatory signage was intentional, designed to provide meaning only to those who had direct knowledge of the incident. Colonel Morrison shared that the investigation into the Afghanistan incident had continued long after the official report was filed. Eventually, investigators had uncovered a larger conspiracy involving multiple intelligence sources who had been feeding false information to coalition forces. The school teacher's death had been just one tragedy in a series of manipulated operations, designed to eliminate personal enemies under the guise of counterterrorism. The systematic nature of the deception provided some context for the individual tragedy, though it didn't diminish the impact on those who had been directly involved. Morrison explained that several of the military personnel from that operation had required extensive psychological support, and some had never fully recovered from the experience. The sniper had eventually left military service entirely, unable to continue in his specialized role. Marcus learned that the emblem was part of a larger classified memorial system that honored victims of intelligence failures across multiple operations and time periods. Only those with direct knowledge of specific incidents could fully understand the meaning of individual memorial pieces, creating a kind of private recognition system within the broader military community. The colonel's explanation began to provide Marcus with a framework for understanding his experience that went beyond personal guilt and trauma. The memorial represented recognition that systematic failures had occurred, and that individuals caught up in those failures deserved acknowledgement rather than blame. It was an admission that the system itself had been flawed, not the people operating within it. Morrison offered to provide Marcus with contact information for specialized counseling services that dealt specifically with trauma related to military intelligence failures. He explained that several programs existed to help both military personnel and civilians like journalists who had been affected by operations that went wrong due to systematic deception. As Marcus's breathing returned to normal and his psychological equilibrium began to stabilize, he found himself able to process the colonel's information more clearly. The panic attack had been triggered not just by the memory of the incident, but by the feeling of being alone with his guilt and responsibility. Learning that others had experienced similar reactions and that support systems existed provided significant relief. The colonel suggested that Marcus might benefit from connecting with others who had been affected by the same incident or similar operations. A support network existed for individuals dealing with trauma related to intelligence failures, though it operated discreetly due to the classified nature of many of the incidents involved. Participation was voluntary but had proven helpful for many people struggling with similar experiences. Marcus realized that his 3 years of attempting to process the trauma individually had been limited by his lack of understanding about the broader context of what had happened. Learning that the incident was part of a pattern of systematic deception rather than an isolated failure, changed his perception of his own role and responsibility. The guilt remained, but it was no longer quite as isolating or personally devastating. 6 months after the exhibition incident, Marcus found himself sitting in a comfortable conference room with 5 other individuals who had been affected by similar intelligence failures during military operations. The support group that Colonel Morrison had recommended had become a crucial part of his healing process, providing the context and community that individual therapy had been unable to offer. The group consisted of 2 former soldiers, an intelligence analyst, a military photographer, and a translator who had worked with coalition forces. Each had been involved in operations that had gone tragically wrong due to deliberately false intelligence, and each had struggled with guilt and trauma despite being victims of systematic deception rather than perpetrators of mistakes. Marcus had initially been reluctant to join the group, concerned about discussing classified operations and unsure whether talking about his experience would help or make things worse. However, the structured environment and the presence of others with similar experiences had provided a safe space to process emotions and memories that had been too difficult to handle alone. Through the group sessions, Marcus learned that the Afghanistan incident had been part of a larger intelligence network that had operated for nearly 2 years before being discovered and shut down. Multiple operations across different countries had been compromised by false information, resulting in civilian casualties and failed missions that had mystified military commanders at the time. The network had been run by individuals who used the chaos of military operations to eliminate personal enemies, settle business disputes, and advance various criminal enterprises. They had exploited the trust and professionalism of military personnel, turning precision weapons and careful planning into tools for personal vendettas. The scope of the deception had been far larger than anyone involved in individual operations had realized. Marcus found that understanding the systematic nature of the deception significantly reduced his personal sense of responsibility and guilt. While he still regretted his presence at the tragic incident, he no longer felt complicit in a moral failure. Instead, he recognized himself as another victim of a criminal conspiracy that had exploited the dedication and professionalism of military personnel and support staff. The journalist had gradually returned to work, though his focus had shifted from covering active military operations to investigating and documenting military accountability and reform efforts. His personal experience with intelligence failures had given him unique insights into systematic problems that needed public attention and institutional solutions. Marcus had also reconnected with several of the military personnel from the Afghanistan operation, including the sniper who had taken the fatal shot. The former marksman had struggled even more than Marcus with the psychological aftermath and had eventually found work as a civilian firearms instructor. Their conversations had been difficult, but ultimately healing for both men. The support group had helped Marcus develop strategies for managing triggers and unexpected reminders of the traumatic incident. While he still experienced occasional anxiety when encountering certain military equipment or situation reminders, the intensity had decreased significantly, and he had learned to recognize and manage his responses more effectively. One of the most valuable aspects of the group experience had been learning that recovery didn't require forgetting or completely overcoming the trauma. Instead, it involved developing a more complete understanding of what had happened and integrating that knowledge into a more balanced perspective on personal responsibility and professional identity. Marcus had started writing a book about intelligence, failures, and their impact on military personnel and civilian support staff. The project had been approved by military authorities after careful review to ensure no classified information would be compromised. The book aimed to document the human cost of systematic deception, while highlighting the need for better oversight and accountability in military intelligence operations. The memorial emblem that had triggered his panic attack had taken on new meaning for Marcus. Instead of representing personal failure and guilt, it now symbolized recognition of shared trauma and the importance of learning from systematic failures. He had even visited the display again during a follow-up exhibition, this time with full understanding of its purpose and meaning. Marcus's relationship with his career had evolved significantly through the healing process. While he maintained his commitment to military journalism He now approached assignments with greater awareness of the psychological risks and better strategies for managing them. His editors had been supportive of his need for occasional breaks and his shift toward investigative work rather than embedded reporting. The support group had also connected Marcus with the family of the school teacher who had been killed in Afghanistan. Through careful mediation and with the assistance of local contacts, he had been able to provide them with a more complete explanation of what had happened and why. While nothing could undo the tragedy, the family had expressed appreciation for his honesty and his efforts to prevent similar incidents. As Marcus reflected on his journey from that traumatic day in the exhibition hall to his current state of recovery and renewed purpose, he recognized that healing had required both personal work and systemic understanding. The individual trauma couldn't be fully addressed without comprehending the larger context of systematic failures and criminal manipulation. The experience had taught Marcus that some forms of trauma require community-based healing rather than individual treatment alone. His connection with others who had experienced similar systematic victimization had provided validation and perspective that individual therapy couldn't offer. Recovery had become a collective process of understanding and mutual support rather than a solitary struggle with guilt and responsibility.